Sometimes the hardest thing isn't losing someone you love. It's losing someone you never got the chance to truly know. Jake Harrison learned this lesson standing in the ashes of his father's burned forest, holding a letter that arrived 3 days too late to say goodbye. When Jake inherited 300 acres of dead trees in Northern California, everyone called him a fool. The neighbors laughed. His teenage son pleaded with him to sell and move on. His ex-wife said he was choosing ash over their boy's future. But Jake saw something different. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the desperation of a single dad with empty pockets and nowhere else to go. His father had been the town hermit for 20 years. What nobody knew was that the old man had been hiding something incredible in those burned hills. Something worth more money than Jake had ever dreamed of. But powerful people were coming for it. Would Jake discover his father's secret before it was too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Harrison's hands still smelled of sawdust and wood stain when he opened the letter from his father's attorney. 3 days had passed since the funeral. A sparse affair with more empty pews than mourners. The envelope bore the return address of Whitmore and Associates, the only law firm in Cedar Ridge willing to handle what everyone assumed was a penniless hermit's estate. The letter was brief and businesslike. Dr. Samuel Harrison had left his son 300 acres of burned forest land, a fire-damaged cabin, and what the attorney delicately termed various research materials of unknown value. No money, no stocks, no insurance policy. Just charred earth that had been worthless before the Mendocino fire swept through 2 years ago and was worth even less now. Jake set the letter on his kitchen table next to a stack of overdue bills and a notice from his landlord. His apartment in Sacramento was small, cramped, and cost more than he could afford on his sporadic carpentry income. The living room doubled as his workshop, sawhorses and lumber competing for space with his 16-year-old son Marcus's video game setup. The whole place smelled of coffee grounds and teenage boy, a combination that had become as familiar as his own reflection. "Dad?" Marcus appeared in the doorway, controller in hand, dark hair falling across eyes that looked too much like his mother's. "You okay? You look like someone died." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Someone had died. His father. The man he'd spoken to exactly 4 times in the past decade. Always brief conversations that left both of them uncomfortable and reaching for reasons to hang up. Samuel Harrison had been brilliant once, a respected environmental scientist with a PhD from UC Berkeley and a reputation for groundbreaking research in forest regeneration. That was before he'd withdrawn from the world, retreating to his property in the mountains like some kind of modern-day hermit. "Just paperwork," Jake said, folding the letter. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Marcus was 17 now, old enough to read the worry lines that had deepened around his father's eyes over the past year, old enough to know that nothing to worry about usually meant the opposite. The phone rang before Marcus could press. Further, Jake's ex-wife Linda's name flashed on the screen, and he felt his shoulders tense automatically. Their conversations had become increasingly strained since the divorce was finalized 18 months ago. She'd remarried quickly. A successful real estate developer named Brad, who drove a BMW and wore suits that cost more than Jake made in a month. Jake. Linda's voice carried that particular edge it had developed since she'd started her new life. "We need to talk about Marcus." "What about him?" "Brad's been looking at private schools. There's a good one near our place that has an excellent college prep program. Marcus could live with us full-time, get the kind of education he deserves." Jake glanced at his son, who was pretending to focus on his game while obviously listening. "Marcus is doing fine where he is he? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're barely keeping your head above water." "The boy needs stability, Jake. He needs a future." The words stung because they carried more than a grain of truth. Jake's carpentry business had been struggling since the economy turned. Good jobs were scarce, and he couldn't compete with the larger contractors who had crews and equipment he couldn't afford. Most days, he felt like he was holding his life together with duct tape and determination. "I can provide for my son," he said, aware of how hollow the words sounded in his cramped apartment. "Can you? Because I heard you were 3 months behind on rent." Jake closed his eyes. Small towns had long memories and loose tongues. "That's temporary. It's been temporary for 6 months. Look, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help. Marcus, he's a smart kid, but he needs opportunities, real opportunities." After Linda hung up, Jake sat in silence, the weight of his failures settling around him like dust. Marcus had abandoned any pretense of playing his game and was watching. His father, with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of incoming storms. "You're not going to make me live with Mom and Brad, are you?" Marcus asked finally. "No," Jake said, though he wondered if that was a promise he could keep. The next morning brought a knock at the door. Jake opened it to find Bill Hendricks, his landlord, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of a man who'd run out of patience. "Jake," Bill nodded toward the papers in his hand, "we need to discuss your situation." They talked on the front steps while Marcus got ready for school. Bill was decent enough, a retired electrician who'd bought the apartment building as an investment and generally treated his tenants fairly. But business was business, and Jake was now 4 months behind. "I like you, Jake, and I know you're trying, but I can't carry you indefinitely. I've got my own mortgage to worry about. I understand. Give me 2 weeks. I've got a job lined up that should get me current." It wasn't entirely a lie. He had a lead on a deck renovation that might pay enough to cover rent if the homeowners didn't decide to go with someone cheaper. Bill studied him for a long moment. 2 weeks. After that, I'll have to start eviction proceedings. Jake nodded and watched the older man walk back to his truck. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of leaf blowers, the constant background noise of suburban maintenance. That evening, Jake spread his father's inheritance paperwork across the kitchen table. The property deed was yellowed with age, showing that Samuel had owned the land for 37 years. There were maps indicating the boundaries, though much of the detail was obscured by fire damage notations from the insurance company. The cabin was described as structurally compromised but potentially salvageable. Marcus joined him at the table, homework forgotten. "So Grandpa left you a bunch of burned trees?" "Looks like it." "That's kind of weird, right? I mean, why would he do that?" Jake had been wondering the same thing. His relationship with his father had been complicated long before the old man became a recluse. Samuel Harrison had been the kind of parent who was more comfortable with plants than people, more interested in the mysteries of soil composition than the daily rhythms of raising a child. After Jake's mother died when he was 12, the distance between father and son had only grown wider. "Maybe he thought it was all he had to give," Jake said finally. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Jake found himself thinking about the times he'd visited his father's property as a child. Before the isolation, before the walls went up between them, there had been moments when Samuel's passion for the natural world had been infectious. Jake remembered walking through dense forest, his father pointing out different species of trees, explaining how they communicated through underground networks of fungi, how they supported each other in ways that most people never noticed. The forest had been beautiful then, towering redwoods and Douglas firs, their canopy so thick that walking beneath them felt like entering a cathedral, streams that ran clear and cold, wildlife that seemed unafraid of human presence. It had been a place of wonder where his father seemed to come alive in ways he never did at home. Now it was gone, reduced to ash and memory. The idea came to him gradually, the way dawn creeps across the horizon. It was crazy, impractical, and probably doomed to failure. But as he lay there listening to Marcus's quiet breathing from the next room, Jake began to consider the impossible. What if he took the inheritance seriously? What if he actually tried to do something with those 300 acres of burned earth? He could move to Cedar Ridge, bring Marcus with him. The cost of living would be a fraction of what they were paying in Sacramento. He could rebuild the cabin, maybe start a small construction business in a town that would appreciate a local carpenter. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was, but it might be possible. The next morning, Jake called the attorney's office and arranged to visit the property. He didn't tell Marcus about his half-formed plans, didn't want to get the boy's hopes up in case the reality proved even worse than he imagined. Instead, he simply said he needed to take a drive up to Cedar Ridge to look at his inheritance. The 2-hour drive took them through rolling hills that gradually gave way to steeper terrain. Cedar Ridge sat in a valley between two mountain ridges, a town of maybe 3,000 people that had grown up around logging and tourism. It had the worn, comfortable look of a place where generations of families had put down roots and stayed. Jake parked at Miller's General Store and asked for directions to the Harrison property. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and knowing eyes, looked him up and down before answering. "You must be Sam's boy," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man, even if he kept to himself these last years." The road to the property was barely more than a dirt track that wound up into the hills through stands of recovering forest. As they climbed higher, Jake began to see the fire's aftermath. Blackened tree trunks stood like sentinels against the sky, and the ground was still covered in ash, despite 2 years of rain and wind. When they finally reached his father's land, Jake pulled over and sat in silence. The devastation was worse than he'd imagined. 300 acres of what had once been pristine forest now looked like the surface of another planet. Here and there, a few trees had survived, their bark scarred, but their canopy still green. But mostly, there was just emptiness, a moonscape of charred stumps and rocky soil. "Wow," Marcus said quietly. "It's like the end of the world." The cabin sat in a clearing near what had been the forest's edge. The structure was still standing, though barely. The roof had partially collapsed, windows were blown out, and the exterior walls were charred black. But the stone foundation looked solid, and Jake's trained eye could see that the basic frame might be salvageable. They climbed out of the truck and walked toward the ruins. The air still carried a faint smell of smoke, as if the earth itself held memories of the fire. Jake's boots crunched on ash and debris as they approached what had once been his father's home. But as they got closer, Jake began to notice things that didn't quite fit the narrative of complete destruction. Near the cabin, patches of ground showed signs of new growth, not the scattered weeds and scrub brush he'd expect, but organized plantings that looked almost deliberate. Young trees that seemed too healthy for the damaged soil, flowers that bloomed in neat rows despite the apparent lack of care. "Dad, look at this," Marcus called from near the cabin's front door. Jake joined his son and found him kneeling next to a wooden box that had somehow survived the fire. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a journal. The cover was hand-tooled leather with his father's initials burned into the front, S.H. The pages inside were covered with Samuel's familiar handwriting, though the content was unlike anything Jake remembered from his father's academic work. The journal was part field notes, part philosophical reflection, part technical manual. Sketches of unusual plant specimens filled the margins, along with detailed observations about growth rates, soil composition, and what his father termed accelerated regeneration protocols. But mixed in with the scientific notation were more impersonal entries, thoughts about legacy, regret, and hope. One passage, dated just 6 months before Samuel's death, made Jake's breath catch. "I know I failed as a father. I know Jacob deserved better from me than the silence I gave him after. Margaret died, but perhaps this work, this place, can be my apology. If something happens to me, if I don't get the chance to explain, maybe he'll understand what I was trying to build here. Not just for the forest, but for him, for his son, for the generations who will need places like this to survive." Marcus was reading over his shoulder, Grandpa wrote about us? Looks like it. They spent the next hour exploring the property more carefully. What Jake had initially taken for random survival and regrowth began to look more intentional. His father had been working to restore the forest, using methods that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about post-fire recovery. Plants that should have taken years to establish were thriving. Soil that should have been barren and acidic showed signs of careful amendment and treatment. Most intriguingly, they found evidence of structures that weren't visible from the main approach. Foundations for buildings that had been carefully concealed, pathways that led deeper into the burned area, and what looked like the entrance to some kind of underground facility. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the skeletal remains of the forest, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. Standing in the ruins of his father's life, surrounded by the first tangible evidence that Samuel Harrison had been more than just a lonely hermit, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. "What do you think, Marcus?" He asked, gesturing at the devastation around them. "Think we could make something of this place?" Marcus looked at him with the careful expression of a teenager trying to read his father's mood. "You mean live here? Like actually move here?" "Maybe. The cabin could be rebuilt. There's plenty of room. And your mom is right about one thing. We need a fresh start." For a moment, Marcus was quiet, looking out over the burned forest with eyes that seemed older than his 17 years. Then he smiled. The first genuine smile Jake had seen from him in months. "Yeah, Dad, I think we could make something of this place." The drive back to Sacramento was quiet. Both Jake and Marcus lost in their own thoughts about what they'd seen. But by the time they reached the city limits, Jake's mind was made up. That evening, he called his landlord and gave notice. Bill Hendricks sounded relieved. 4 months of missed rent had clearly been weighing on both of them. "You sure about this, Jake? Cedar Ridge isn't exactly a booming job market." "I'm sure," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely certain what he was sure about. Only that staying in Sacramento felt like slow drowning, and the burned forest offered something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning brought the first real resistance to his plan. Linda arrived unannounced, her BMW looking out of place in the apartment complex parking lot. She knocked with the sharp, insistent rhythm of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Have you lost your mind?" she demanded the moment Jake opened the door. "Marcus told me about your little plan to drag him off to some burned wasteland." "It's not a wasteland, Linda. It's 300 acres of dead trees and a fire-damaged shack. How is that better for our son than a stable home with actual opportunities?" Marcus emerged from his room, backpack slung over his shoulder. "Mom, I want to go with Dad." "You're 17, Marcus. You don't get to make decisions that will ruin your future." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt the familiar surge of inadequacy that Linda's presence always triggered. She looked successful in her tailored business suit and expensive jewelry. Everything he wasn't, and probably never would be. "Your mother's right about one thing," Jake said carefully. "This is a big decision. If you want to stay here, finish. High school with your friends? Dad, no." Marcus's voice was firm in a way that reminded Jake of his own father. "I've been thinking about it all night. What you showed me yesterday, Grandpa's journal, his work, that's more interesting than anything I'm doing here. Besides, maybe he left all that stuff for a reason." Linda's expression shifted from anger to something closer to desperation. "Marcus, honey, you don't understand what you're giving up. Brad's already started the application process for Westfield Academy. They have a 90% college acceptance rate, and they probably cost more than Dad makes in a year," Marcus said. "I'm not stupid, Mom. I know we're broke. I know you and Brad think Dad's a failure. But maybe there's more than one way to build a life." The argument continued for another hour, but Jake could see that Marcus had made up his mind. In the end, Linda left with threats of legal action and promises that she wouldn't let them throw away Marcus's future on some romantic notion about forest restoration. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake sold what furniture wouldn't fit in a moving truck, packed up their modest belongings, and said goodbye to a life that had never quite felt like it fit. His few friends in Sacramento seemed puzzled by the decision, and most of his customers were understanding but unable to offer work in rural Northern California. The drive to Cedar Ridge felt different this time. Instead of a day trip to survey damage, it was the beginning of something new. Marcus had been quiet for most of the journey, staring out the window as familiar landscapes gave way to unfamiliar ones. "You scared?" Jake asked, as they turned onto the dirt road leading to the property. "Yeah," Marcus admitted. "But maybe scared is better than stuck." They set up camp in the ruins of Samuel's cabin the first night. Sleeping bags spread on the floor of the one room that still had an intact roof. Jake lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, not the traffic and sirens of the city, but wind through damaged trees, the distant call of night birds, and something else he couldn't quite identify. A sense of presence, as if the land itself was aware of their arrival. The next morning, Jake began the methodical work of assessment. The cabin's foundation was solid, and more of the structure was salvageable than he'd initially hoped. The electrical system was shot, and there was no running water, but the basic bones of a home remained. With careful work and materials he could afford, it might be possible to create something livable. Marcus proved surprisingly helpful, his teenage energy directed toward clearing debris and salvaging usable materials. But it was while they were working to clear the area around the cabin that they made their first real discovery. Marcus was using a shovel to move ash and debris when the blade struck something solid. "Dad, there's something buried here." Jake joined him, and together they carefully excavated what turned out to be a stone marker. It was roughly 2 feet tall and carved with intricate symbols that looked far older than anything Samuel might have created. The patterns were geometric but organic, suggesting flowing water or wind patterns. At the base of the stone, barely visible beneath years of accumulated debris, were fresher markings, Samuel's initials and a date from 5 years ago. "What do you think it means?" Marcus asked, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. Before Jake could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A dusty Jeep Cherokee pulled up near their campsite, and a woman climbed out. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent more time outdoors than in offices. "You must be Jake." "Harrison," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I work with the Forest Service. Did some consulting with your father before he passed." Jake shook her hand, noting the strength of her grip and the intelligence in her brown eyes. "I didn't know my father worked with anyone. He kept to himself mostly, but we corresponded about his restoration work. I'm actually a botanist, specializing in post-fire recovery. Your father's methods were—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Unconventional, but remarkably effective." Elena's attention was drawn to the stone marker they'd just uncovered. She knelt beside it, examining the carvings with obvious interest. "This is fascinating. These symbols look indigenous, possibly Yurok. Your father never mentioned this. You knew about his restoration work, some of it. He was very secretive, but I'd heard reports about accelerated growth rates on his property. Frankly, I thought they were exaggerated until I saw some of his documentation." She looked up at Jake. "Are you planning to continue his research?" Jake found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the question. "I'm thinking about it, though I'm not sure I understand what he was doing." Elena stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Would you mind if I took a look around? With your permission, I'd like to document some of the recovery patterns I'm seeing, for scientific purposes." They spent the next 2 hours walking the property with Elena, who pointed out details that Jake and Marcus had missed. Areas where new growth was following patterns that didn't match typical post-fire succession, plants that shouldn't have been able to establish in the damaged soil, but were thriving. Most intriguingly, sections where the forest seemed to be recovering at rates that defied conventional timelines. "Your father was doing something remarkable here," Elena said, as they stood in a grove where young trees were already reaching toward. The canopy. I've never seen recovery patterns like this. It's almost as if he found a way to accelerate the natural healing process. That evening, Elena joined them for dinner around a camp stove, sharing stories about her work and asking thoughtful questions about Jake's plans. Marcus seemed to come alive in the presence of someone who took his grandfather's work seriously, asking questions about forest ecology and plant biology that surprised Jake with their sophistication. As darkness fell, and they built a small fire, in a safe clearing, Elena brought up something that had been troubling her. "Jake, I should mention that your father's work has attracted some attention. There's a biotech company that's been asking questions about his research. Biogenesis Corporation. They've been trying to get access to his property for months." "For what?" "They claim to be interested in sustainable forestry practices, but they're primarily a pharmaceutical company. They've been acquiring patents on various botanical discoveries, particularly anything related to accelerated plant growth or enhanced soil regeneration." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you saying they might try to take this land?" "I'm saying be careful. Companies like that have resources and legal teams. If they believe your father discovered something valuable, they won't give up easily." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching through the forest. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the clearing, their headlights cutting through the darkness like accusations. 3 men in expensive suits climbed out, looking profoundly out of place in the wilderness setting. The leader was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. "Mr. Harrison, I presume," he said, not waiting for an invitation to approach their fire. "I'm David Kellerman, Senior Acquisition Specialist with Biogenesis Corporation. I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss." Jake stood slowly, aware that Marcus and Elena had moved closer together, creating a united front. "It's pretty late for a business call. Time is money in my business, Mr. Harrison. I understand you've inherited your father's property. We'd like to make you an offer. The land isn't for sale." Kellerman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Harrison. It's just a matter of finding the right price. We're prepared to offer you $2 million for your father's property and all associated research materials." The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $2 million would solve every financial problem Jake had ever faced. It would secure Marcus's future, pay for college, provide the kind of stability that Linda insisted their son deserved. But looking at the carved stone marker, thinking about his father's journal and the mysterious work that had consumed the last years of Samuel's life, Jake found himself shaking his head. "I said the land isn't for sale." Kellerman's smile turned cold. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think you understand the situation. Your father's research belongs to Biogenesis. He developed it while under contract with us. We're being generous by offering to purchase rather than simply taking what's legally ours. My father left this land to me. Whatever he did here, he did on his own property with his own resources. That's a matter for the courts to decide. But litigation can be expensive, Mr. Harrison, and lengthy. How long do you think you can afford to fight a company with unlimited resources?" Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Kellerman, Dr. Harrison's research was conducted independently. I have documentation of his work that predates any corporate involvement." Kellerman's attention shifted to her with predatory focus. "Dr. Vasquez, isn't it? I'd be careful about making claims you can't substantiate. Academic careers can be fragile things." The threat was delivered with polite professionalism, but it was unmistakably a threat. Jake felt anger building in his chest, the same protective instinct that had gotten him into trouble as a younger man. "I think this conversation is over," he said. "You're on my property without permission." "For now," Kellerman agreed. "But property rights can change, Mr. Harrison. Courts can be influenced. Eminent domain can be declared. There are many ways to achieve our objectives." After the corporate representatives left, the three of them sat in silence around the dying fire. The mountain night seemed darker, more threatening than it had moments before. "They're serious," Elena said finally. "Biogenesis has a reputation for getting what they want." "Let them try," Marcus said with the fierce loyalty of youth. "This is our land. Grandpa left it to us for a reason." Jake looked at his son, seeing something of his own stubborn determination reflected in the boy's face. Maybe Linda was right. Maybe he was dragging Marcus into a fight they couldn't win. But as he thought about Kellerman's casual threats, about the implication that his father's life's work was somehow corporate property, Jake felt his resolve hardening. "Elena," he said, "how much do you know about my father's research methods?" "Not nearly enough, but I'd like to learn more." Jake nodded, staring into the fire's embers. "Then I guess we'd better figure out what he discovered up here, because something tells me those men aren't going away until they get what they came for." Dawn came with the sound of chainsaws in the distance, other landowners clearing fire damage, preparing for the long process of recovery that could take decades. Jake woke in his sleeping bag, feeling the weight of his decision settling around him like the morning mist. In daylight, the corporate threats of the previous evening seemed both more real and more manageable. He had work to do. Marcus was already up, poking at the coals of their fire and heating water for coffee in a battered pot they'd found in the cabin's ruins. The boy had adapted to camp life with the resilience of youth, but Jake could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Sleep okay?" Jake asked. "Good enough. I was thinking about what those guys said last night. About Grandpa working for them. What about it? It doesn't make sense. If he was doing research for some big company, why would he be living like a hermit up here? Why would he leave the land to us instead of them?" It was a good point, and it echoed Jake's own thoughts. Samuel Harrison had been many things, distant, obsessive, difficult to understand, but he'd never been dishonest. If he'd had obligations to a corporation, he would have honored them, regardless of the personal cost. Elena arrived mid-morning, bringing coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through charcoal and a box of supplies from town. She also brought news. "I did some research on biogenesis last night," she said, setting down her thermos. "They're a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate based in Switzerland. Their primary business is acquiring and patenting biological discoveries, particularly anything related to agriculture or environmental restoration." "Patent trolls," Marcus said with disgust. "More sophisticated than that, but yes, they find researchers doing innovative work, usually in academic or independent settings, then find ways to claim ownership of the discoveries, sometimes through old employment contracts, sometimes through legal challenges to patent applications, sometimes through outright acquisition of the research facilities." Jake felt a chill of recognition. They've done this before, many times, and they usually win because they have resources that individual researchers can't match. They spent the morning working on the cabin, Jake and Marcus clearing debris while Elena documented the unusual plant growth patterns around the property. It was physical work that helped Jake think, his hands finding familiar rhythms of measuring, cutting, and fitting that had sustained him through years of carpentry. But their work was interrupted by a discovery that changed everything. Marcus was clearing debris from what had once been Samuel's workshop when his shovel struck something metallic. Together, they excavated a fireproof safe that had been buried beneath the floorboards. It was scorched but intact, and after 20 minutes of careful work with a crowbar, Jake managed to force it open. Inside were items that transformed their understanding of Samuel's work. The first was a collection of seed pods, unlike anything Jake had ever seen. They were roughly the size of golf balls, with a crystalline structure that seemed to pulse with internal light. Each pod was carefully labeled with coordinates, dates, and cryptic notations in Samuel's handwriting. The second item was more conventional, but equally intriguing, a detailed map of the property marked with symbols that corresponded to the carved stone they'd found. The map showed locations throughout the burned forest, where Samuel had been conducting experiments. each site marked with specific dates and results. But it was the third item that made Jake's hands shake as he lifted it from the safe. It was a letter addressed to him, sealed in waterproof plastic and dated just 6 months before Samuel's death. "Jacob," the letter began, using the formal name that no one but his father had ever called him. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to complete the work that has consumed the last 20 years of my life. More importantly, I have failed to bridge the distance I created between us after your mother died." Jake's throat tightened. At the reference to his mother, Samuel had never spoken of her death, never acknowledged the grief that had driven him into isolation. "I know you believe I withdrew from your life because I found my research more important than my son. The truth is more complicated and more painful. After Margaret died, I realized that the world we were leaving you and your children might not be habitable. The climate crisis, deforestation, the collapse of ecosystems, these aren't distant problems, Jacob. They are the defining challenge of your generation." The letter went on to explain Samuel's research in terms that a non-scientist could understand. For 20 years, he had been developing what he called accelerated restoration protocols, methods for healing damaged ecosystems at rates far beyond what nature could achieve alone. The seed pods were the culmination of that work, containing genetically enhanced plants that could establish in damaged soil and create conditions for rapid forest recovery. "The technology works, Jacob. I have documentation proving that forest ecosystems can be restored in months rather than decades, but the implications are profound. In the wrong hands, this knowledge could be used to justify further environmental destruction. Clear-cut forests could be replanted with artificial speed, removing the economic incentives for conservation." Elena had been reading over Jake's shoulder, her breathing becoming more rapid as she absorbed the implications. "This is incredible," she whispered. "If this is real, if your father actually developed functional accelerated restoration protocols, this could change everything." "There's more," Jake said, turning the page. Samuel's letter continued. "I have been approached by various interests, both corporate and governmental, who wish to acquire my research. I've refused all offers because I believe this technology must be carefully controlled and ethically implemented. It should be used to heal the damage we have already done, not to enable further destruction." The final paragraph made Jake's decision inevitable. "I'm leaving this research to you, Jacob, because I trust you to understand what your mother and I tried to teach you, that we are caretakers of this earth, not its owners. Use this knowledge wisely, protect it from those who would exploit it, and perhaps in doing so you can accomplish what I never could: heal the wounds between generations." The letter was signed simply, "Your father, Samuel." Jake looked up to find Elena and Marcus watching him with expressions of wonder and concern. The weight of inheritance had suddenly become much heavier than 300 acres of burned forest. "We need to test these," Elena said, indicating the seed pods. "If your father's claims are accurate." "They are." The voice came from behind them, and they turned to see an elderly Native American woman approaching through the forest. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness, her silver hair braided with feathers and small bones. "I'm Rose Crow Feather," she said, nodding toward each of them in turn. "I knew your father, Jake Harrison, worked with him for many years on this project." Jake stood slowly, aware that something significant was happening. "You knew about his research?" "More than knew. Helped develop it. Your father was a good man, but he was also a stubborn one. Took him years to understand that you cannot heal the land without honoring the people who stewarded it first." Rose's weathered hands gestured toward the burned forest around them. "This land has been healing itself for thousands of years. Your father learned to work with those natural processes, not against them. The Yurok people have knowledge about forest management that goes back generations." Samuel finally learned to listen. Elena stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding social awkwardness. "You're saying Dr. Harrison combined indigenous land management practices with modern biotechnology?" "I'm saying he learned that the Earth already knows how to heal itself. We just had to remember how to help it along." Rose walked over to the carved stone marker and placed her hand on its surface. "This marks sacred ground, a place where the old ways and new knowledge meet. Your father spent years earning the right to work here." "And now?" Jake asked. "Now that right passes to you, if you choose to accept it." Rose reached into a leather pouch at her belt and withdrew a wooden key, intricately carved with symbols that matched those on the stone marker. "There are things your father built that you haven't found yet, places where his real work was done. But first, you must understand what you're choosing." She handed Jake the key, and he was surprised by its warmth, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. "Men in expensive suits came to our tribal council 3 months ago," Rose continued. "Said they had legal rights to your father's research. Said they represented the future of environmental restoration. We sent them away, but they'll be back." "Biogenesis," Elena said. "Yes, they don't understand that some knowledge cannot be owned, cannot be bought or sold or patented. The Earth's wisdom belongs to everyone, or it belongs to no one." Jake turned the key over in his hands, feeling its weight and the smoothness of wood worn by careful handling. "What does this open?" "Your father's real laboratory, the place where he learned to listen to what the forest was trying to tell him." But the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the damaged trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jake looked at Marcus, who was watching the exchange with fascination, then at Elena, who was clearly struggling to reconcile her scientific training with what she was hearing. "Before I make any decisions," Jake said, "I need to understand what I'm getting into. What exactly did my father discover?" Rose smiled, and for the first time since she'd appeared, she looked genuinely pleased. "The right question. Come, let me show you what 20 years of listening to the land can accomplish." She led them to a section of the burned forest that looked no different from any other. Charred stumps, ash-covered ground, the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving ecosystem. But Rose knelt and brushed away surface debris to reveal a metal hatch set into the ground. "Your father's true workshop," she said, gesturing for Jake to use the key. The key fit perfectly into a hidden lock mechanism. With a soft click, the hatch opened to reveal a stairway leading down into the earth. Emergency lighting flickered to life, powered by what looked like a solar battery system. "He built this over 15 years, Rose explained, as they descended into a surprisingly large underground chamber. Wanted a place to work that would survive fire, flood, or corporate raiders." The laboratory that Jake found himself in was unlike anything he could have imagined. It was part scientific research facility, part traditional indigenous knowledge center, part garden. Living plants grew under full-spectrum lights, their roots extending into carefully monitored soil systems. Computer workstations displayed real-time data about growth rates, soil chemistry, and atmospheric conditions, and everywhere carefully preserved samples of the seed pods they'd found in the safe. "Your father called it the Restoration Chamber," Rose said. "Here he learned to combine the old knowledge with new tools. The results speak for themselves." Elena was moving from station to station, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is incredible. The level of sophistication. This represents decades of research. And now it's yours," Rose said to Jake, "if you choose to continue his work." Jake stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by his father's life's work, and felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders. Outside, corporate interests were circling, threatening to take by force what they couldn't acquire through purchase. His son was counting on him to provide stability and a future. His ex-wife was probably right that he was in over his head, but as he looked at the evidence of his father's dedication, at the fusion of ancient wisdom and modern science that filled the chamber, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since his mother's death: a sense of purpose larger than his own immediate needs. "Rose," he said finally, "if I choose to continue this work, what am I really choosing?" The older woman's eyes grew serious. "You're choosing to stand against powerful people who see the earth as something to be exploited rather than protected. You're choosing to honor your father's legacy while making it your own. And you're choosing to fight for your son's future, even if the battle seems impossible." Jake looked at Marcus, who was examining one of the monitoring stations with intense concentration. "What do you think, son?" Marcus looked up, and for a moment Jake saw not his teenage boy, but the man he was becoming. "I think Grandpa left us something worth fighting for." That evening, as they sat around their campfire with Rose, Elena, and the weight of decision pressing down on them, Jake made his choice. He would continue his father's work. He would learn to use the tools and knowledge Samuel had assembled, and he would find a way to protect it from those who would turn healing into another form of harm. He had no idea how much that choice would cost him. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of learning and discovery that challenged everything Jake thought he knew about restoration, both environmental and personal. Each morning, he and Marcus descended into Samuel's underground laboratory, while Elena documented their findings, and Rose shared knowledge that had been passed down through generations of her people. The restoration chamber operated like a symphony of science and intuition. Samuel had designed systems that monitored not just soil chemistry and plant growth, but also subtler factors, the electromagnetic patterns of healthy ecosystems, the acoustic signatures of thriving forests, even the mycelial networks that connected plant roots across vast distances. "Your father understood something that most scientists miss," Rose explained, as she showed Jake how to read the complex displays. "Plants don't grow in isolation. They grow in relationship with the soil, with each other, with the larger web of life." His technology worked because it restored those relationships, not just individual species. Marcus proved to have an intuitive grasp of the systems that surprised even Rose. He could look at the growth patterns displayed on the monitors and predict which experimental plots would thrive and which would struggle. When Elena asked him how he knew, Marcus just shrugged. "It makes sense, I guess. Like you can see where the connections are strong and where they're broken." Elena's scientific background allowed her to translate Samuel's work into terms that regulatory agencies might understand, but she was clearly struggling with some of the less conventional aspects of the research. "The data is solid," she told Jake after a week of intensive study. "The growth rates, soil recovery, species reestablishment, it's all documented and reproducible, but some of the theoretical framework—" She paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Let's just say it wouldn't be well received in peer review." "You mean the parts about listening to the forest?" Marcus asked with a grin. "I mean the parts that can't be quantified with traditional scientific instruments." Rose laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Western science is good at counting things, not so good at understanding relationships. Your grandfather learned to do both." As Jake became more familiar with his father's work, he began to understand why biogenesis was so interested in acquiring udrin. The potential applications were staggering. Forest restoration after logging or fire could be accomplished in months instead of decades. Agricultural soil damaged by industrial farming could be healed rapidly. Even urban environments could be transformed with the right application of Samuel's techniques. But he also began to understand his father's concerns about commercialization. The technology worked precisely because it was holistic. It couldn't be reduced to a simple product or formula that could be patented and mass-produced. It required understanding, patience, and respect for natural processes. In the wrong hands, it could easily be misused. These concerns became more pressing when Elena brought disturbing news from town. "I stopped by the county planning office," she said, joining them around their evening campfire. "Biogenesis has filed applications for mineral rights surveys on several properties adjacent to yours." They're also backing a development proposal for a luxury resort that would require a new access road right through your land. Jake felt his stomach tighten. They're trying to force me out. Worse than that. If they can establish legitimate business interests in the area, they'll have legal grounds to pursue eminent domain proceedings. They could literally take your property for economic development. Marcus threw a stick into the fire with unnecessary force. That's totally illegal, isn't it? Unfortunately, no, Elena said. Eminent domain laws are complex, but they've been used to transfer private property to corporate interests before, especially when local governments are convinced that the economic benefits outweigh individual property rights. Rose had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the gravity of someone who had seen such battles fought before. People have experience with losing land to corporations, she said. The legal system is designed to favor those with money and lawyers. But there are other ways to fight. What kind of ways? Jake asked. Tomorrow I want you to meet someone, my grandson, Tommy. He's been working with your father for the past 2 years, learning the old plant knowledge alongside the new techniques. He has, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, special insights into how the restoration process works. The next morning, Rose led them to a section of the burned forest that Jake hadn't explored before. Here, the devastation was complete. Not a single tree had survived the fire, and the ground was still mostly bare soil and ash 2 years after the burn. But as they walked deeper into the area, Jake began to notice changes. Small green shoots, emerging from what should have been sterile ground. Patches of moss that seemed to glow with unusual vitality, and everywhere a sense of purposeful activity that was almost tangible. "Tommy!" Rose called toward a grove of surviving trees at the edge of the burned area. A young man emerged from the forest, perhaps 20 years old, with the lean build of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught Jake's attention. They held an intensity and focus that reminded him of his father, but also a kind of joy that Samuel had rarely shown. "This is my grandson," Rose said as Tommy approached. "He's been continuing your father's work in the areas most damaged by the fire." Tommy nodded to Jake and Marcus, but seemed uncomfortable with direct eye contact. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but precise. "Dr. Harrison taught me to see the connections," he said. "Most people look at burned forest and see destruction, but the networks are still there, underground. The mycelium, the root connections, the soil communities. They're damaged but not destroyed. They just need the right kind of help to start healing." Elena leaned forward with interest. "What kind of help?" Tommy looked at her briefly, then focused on a point somewhere past her shoulder. "The plants that grew here before the fire, they left chemical signatures in the soil. Messages about what kinds of conditions they preferred, what nutrients they needed, what other plants they worked well with. If you know how to read those messages, you can create new plants that remember the old relationships. That's what the seed pods do," Marcus said with sudden understanding. "They don't just grow fast. They grow in harmony with what was here before." Tommy smiled, and for the first time made direct eye contact. "Exactly. Your grandfather understood that restoration isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about remembering what worked." Over the following hours, Tommy led them through sections of forest where Samuel's techniques had been implemented. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Areas that should have remained barren for decades were showing signs of robust ecosystem recovery. Young trees were growing at impossible rates, their root systems establishing complex relationships with beneficial fungi and bacteria. Wildlife was returning. Birds, small mammals, even some of the larger herbivores that had fled during the fire. "How is this possible?" Elena asked, taking soil samples for later analysis. Tommy knelt next to a thriving grove of young Douglas firs. "The old knowledge says that the forest wants to heal itself. It has the information, the ability, the motivation. It just needs someone to help it remember how. And the new knowledge, provides tools to amplify what the forest already knows, genetic markers that preserve successful adaptations, soil treatments that restore beneficial microbial communities, seed coatings that protect young plants while they're establishing root connections. Jake watched his son absorbing Tommy's explanations with fascination. Marcus had always been bright, but this was the first time Jake had seen him truly engaged with learning. Maybe Elena was right about the boy having special insights into the restoration process. That afternoon, while Elena and Marcus worked with Tommy to document the recovery, Pattons, Jake and Rose walked through the original forest area where Samuel had conducted his first experiments. "Your father was a good student," Rose said, as they paused beside the stone marker, "but he was also stubborn. Took him years to accept that indigenous knowledge might have something to teach him. What changed his mind? Failure. His early attempts at accelerated restoration were disasters. Plants that grew quickly but couldn't adapt to local conditions. Soil treatments that worked in laboratory conditions but failed in the field. He was trying to impose solutions instead of discovering them. They sat on a fallen log that had been positioned to overlook a small valley where young trees were growing in careful patterns. "When did you first meet him?" Jake asked. "About 15 years ago. He came to our tribal council asking permission to study traditional plant knowledge. Most of the elders were suspicious. We'd had bad experiences with researchers who took our knowledge and claimed it as their own discoveries. But you trusted him. Eventually, he kept coming back, not demanding access, but asking how he could earn it. He volunteered for restoration projects on reservation land. He shared his laboratory resources with our environmental programs. Most importantly, he listened." Jake found himself thinking about his own relationship with his father. "I wish he'd been that patient with family." Rose studied him with eyes that seemed to see deeper than surface appearances. "Your father carried great guilt about your mother's death. He blamed himself for not being able to save her from the cancer, for not being strong enough to help you through the grief. He threw himself into this work, partly because he hoped it might somehow make up for his failures as a husband and father." The words hit Jake with unexpected force. He had spent years resenting Samuel's withdrawal, interpreting it as indifference or selfishness. The possibility that his father's isolation had been driven by guilt and grief, emotions Jake understood all too well, reframed decades of pain. "He never said anything," Jake managed. "He didn't know how. Your father was brilliant with plants and soil chemistry, but human emotions were a foreign language to him, especially after Margaret died." That evening, as they gathered around their campfire, Jake found himself looking at his inheritance with new eyes. The burned forest wasn't just damaged land that needed restoration, it was his father's attempt to heal wounds that went deeper than fire damage. Samuel had been trying to create something that would outlast his own failures, something that might serve as an apology he'd never known how to speak aloud. But their quiet reflection was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching through the darkness. This time, it wasn't just biogenesis representatives. It was a convoy that included county sheriff's vehicles and what looked like federal agents. David Kellerman emerged from the lead SUV, flanked by men in dark suits who radiated the quiet authority of federal law enforcement. Behind them, Jake recognized County Sheriff Davis, a man he'd met once in town who'd seemed sympathetic to Jake's situation. "Mr. Harrison," Kellerman said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who held winning cards, "I'm afraid we have some legal issues to discuss." One of the federal agents stepped forward, flashing credentials that identified him as Agent Martinez from the Department of Agriculture. "Mr. Harrison, we've received reports of unauthorized biotechnology research being conducted on this property. Federal law requires that any genetic modification work be conducted in approved facilities with appropriate oversight." Elena stood up from the fire. "What genetic modification work?" "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Martinez consulted a tablet. "We understand." You've been documenting accelerated plant growth rates on this property. Growth rates that exceed natural parameters suggest genetic enhancement, which falls under federal biotech regulations. That's ridiculous, Marcus said hotly. Grandpa was just helping plants grow better. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Agent Martinez replied. If Dr. Samuel Harrison was conducting genetic modification research without proper permits, any resulting organisms must be quarantined until they can be properly evaluated. Kellerman's smile was predatory, which means, Mr. Harrison, that your property will need to be sealed while federal investigators determine whether your father's work poses any environmental risks. Jake felt the trap closing around them. This is about the biogenesis patents, isn't it? This is about public safety, Agent Martinez said firmly. If your father developed organisms that could alter natural ecosystems, we need to understand the implications before allowing further experimentation. Rose stepped into the circle of light cast by their fire. Agent Martinez, I am Rose Crow. Feather, Environmental Coordinator for the Yurok Tribal Council. Dr. Harrison's research was conducted in partnership with our traditional ecological knowledge programs. All work was done in accordance with indigenous sovereignty rights. The agent's confident expression faltered slightly. Ma'am, federal biotechnology regulations supersede. Federal regulations recognize tribal sovereignty in matters of traditional ecological knowledge, Rose interrupted. Dr. Harrison's research was conducted under tribal oversight and with our full consent. Kellerman stepped forward impatiently. This is all very interesting, but the fact remains that Biogenesis Corporation holds valid patents on several of the processes being used. Here, Mr. Harrison is continuing research that rightfully belongs to us. Prove it, Elena said suddenly. All eyes turned to her as she pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through documents. I've spent the past week reviewing Dr. Harrison's research logs. Every technique, every biological process, every technological innovation is documented with dates and methodology. If Biogenesis claims prior ownership, they'll need to provide evidence that predates Dr. Harrison's work. Jake watched Kellerman's face as the corporate lawyer realized that Elena had been preparing for exactly this moment. Her scientific training hadn't just been documenting Samuel's work, it had been building a legal case for its originality and independence. Dr. Harrison's employment contract with Biogenesis clearly states, Kellerman began. Dr. Harrison's employment with Biogenesis ended 12 years ago, Elena interrupted, consulting her tablet. His contract included a standard non-compete clause, but that expired after 5 years. All research conducted after that date is his independent intellectual property. Agent Martinez looked frustrated. Regardless of patent disputes, if genetic modification has occurred, no genetic modification has occurred, Tommy said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the young man, who had been silent throughout the confrontation. Dr. Harrison's techniques work with natural plant genetics, not against them. He identified markers for beneficial traits that already exist in forest ecosystems, then created conditions that encourage those traits to express themselves. I'm afraid that's still considered genetic enhancement under federal guidelines, Agent Martinez said. Not if it's done using traditional indigenous methods, Rose said firmly. Selective breeding, habitat modification, and soil treatment have been used by my people for thousands of years. Federal law specifically protects traditional ecological practices. Jake could see that the legal situation was more complex than either side had anticipated. But he could also see that Kellerman and his federal allies weren't going to be deterred by legal technicalities. Gentlemen, Jake said finally, it's late and this is clearly going to require some careful legal review. I suggest we schedule a meeting with appropriate attorneys present. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Agent Martinez said. Until we can verify the safety of the biological agents being used here, This property needs to be quarantined. Sheriff Davis, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Agent Martinez, with respect, you don't have jurisdiction to quarantine private property without a federal court order. We have emergency authority. You have emergency authority to investigate. You don't have authority to seize property without due process. Kellerman's frustration was becoming visible. Sheriff, I hope you understand the economic implications of obstructing this investigation. Biogenesis has significant investments planned for this region. Mr. Kellerman, I hope you understand that I swore an oath to uphold the law, not to protect corporate investments. The standoff continued for another hour, with threats and legal citations flying from both sides. But in the end, the federal agents withdrew without seizing the property, though they made it clear that they would return with court orders if necessary. As the convoy of vehicles disappeared into the darkness, Jake felt the weight of what they were facing settle around him like a physical burden. They weren't just fighting for his father's research anymore. They were fighting against the full resources of corporate and government power. They'll be back, Elena said quietly. Yes, they will, Rose agreed. But now we know what we're really dealing with. This isn't about patents or regulations. This is about control. They want to own your father's discoveries so they can profit from them, and they'll use whatever legal tools they can find to make that happen. Tommy had been examining the area where the federal agents had stood, as if reading signs invisible to the rest of them. We need to accelerate the timeline, he said suddenly. If they're going to try to take the research, we need to make sure it can't be contained. What do you mean? Jake asked. Tommy looked up, and in the firelight his eyes held the intensity of someone who had seen a crucial truth. Your father's work doesn't belong in a laboratory. It belongs in the forest. If we implement the restoration protocols across a large enough area, if we create a living demonstration of what this technology can accomplish, it becomes much harder for them to simply seize and suppress it. Marcus leaned forward eagerly. You mean restore the entire burned area? I mean restore enough of it that the success becomes undeniable. Make it a model that other forest communities want to replicate. Turn it into something too valuable to destroy. Jake looked around the circle of faces illuminated by their fire, Elena with her scientific determination, Rose with her traditional wisdom, Tommy with his unique insights, and Marcus with his youthful optimism, and realized that somewhere along the way they had become more than individuals fighting separate battles. They had become a team. How long would something like that take? He asked. With the protocols your father developed and the knowledge base we've built together. Maybe 6 months to show significant results, Elena said. A year to create something truly spectacular. And how long before Biogenesis comes back with federal court orders? Maybe 2 weeks, Rose said grimly. Jake stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker like the future he was trying to imagine. 2 weeks to prepare for a battle that could determine not just his own fate, but the fate of his father's revolutionary work. Then we'd better get started, he said. The stolen documents arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous-looking young man who identified himself only as a friend of environmental justice. He handed Elena a manila envelope and disappeared back into the forest before anyone could ask questions. Inside were photocopied Biogenesis internal memos, emails, and strategic planning documents that painted a chilling picture of corporate manipulation. Jake spread the papers across the table in Samuel's underground laboratory, while Elena, Rose, Tommy, and Marcus gathered around to examine the evidence. Look at this, Elena said, pointing to an email dated 6 months before Samuel's death. They've been planning to acquire his research for over a year. They knew exactly what he was working on. The documents revealed that Biogenesis had been monitoring Samuel's work through environmental impact reports, patent searches, and even satellite imagery of his property. They had identified his restoration protocols as potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and had developed a systematic plan to acquire the technology. But the most disturbing revelation was their strategy for dealing with what they termed acquisition resistance. The company had detailed plans for using regulatory agencies, environmental concerns, and even eminent domain proceedings to force unwilling researchers to surrender their work. "They've done this before," Marcus said, reading over a case study of a similar acquisition in Oregon. 3 years ago, they took over a mycologist's research on soil regeneration using the exact same tactics. Tommy was studying a diagram that showed Biogenesis's planned development of the technology. They want to turn it into a commercial product, sell restoration services to logging companies and mining operations, make it profitable to destroy forests because they can be quickly replanted. Jake felt sick as he realized the implications. "My father developed this technology to heal damaged ecosystems, not to enable more damage. That's exactly why he refused to work with them," Rose said, examining what appeared to be a transcript of a phone conversation between Samuel and a Biogenesis representative. "He understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to commercialize." Elena had been quiet, reading through technical documents that outlined Biogenesis's understanding of Samuel's methods. "They know more than they should," she said finally. "Some of these details about the seed pod composition and soil treatment protocols. This information came from inside the research program." "You think there's a spy?" Marcus asked. "I think someone has been feeding them information for months, maybe longer. The possibility that someone they trusted might be working with Biogenesis cast a shadow over their planning. But they didn't have time to investigate. According to the stolen documents, Biogenesis was moving forward with their legal strategy immediately, filing for injunctive relief that would shut down Jake's restoration work, while ownership of Samuel's research was determined in court. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Jake decided. "If we're going to demonstrate that this technology works, we need to do it before they can stop us." Over the next week, they implemented the most ambitious restoration effort any of them had ever attempted. Working from dawn until after dark, they prepared sections of the burned forest for Samuel's accelerated protocols. Jake and Marcus focused on site preparation, clearing debris, testing soil conditions, and installing the monitoring equipment that would document their progress. Elena and Tommy collaborated on preparing the seed pods and soil treatments, scaling up Samuel's laboratory processes to cover dozens of acres. Rose coordinated with other tribal elders, bringing in traditional knowledge about plant communities and ecological relationships that would guide where different species should be established. The work was exhausting, but Jake found himself energized by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his divorce. For the first time in years, he was building something instead of just trying to survive. And he was doing it alongside his son, who had thrown himself into the project with enthusiasm that reminded Jake of his own younger self. "Dad," Marcus said one evening as they finished installing a monitoring station, "do you think Mom would understand why we're doing this?" Jake paused, considering how to answer. Linda's phone calls had become increasingly hostile as she realized that Jake and Marcus weren't coming back to Sacramento. She'd threatened legal action, accused Jake of brainwashing their son, and demanded that Marcus return to civilization immediately. "I think your mom is scared," Jake said finally. "She wants what's best for you, but she defines best as safe and predictable. This," he gestured toward the restoration work around them, "isn't either of those things. But it matters." "Yes, it matters." Marcus nodded, satisfied with that answer. At 17, he was old enough to understand that sometimes the most important work was also the most dangerous. Their progress over the first week exceeded even Elena's optimistic projections. Areas where they had implemented Samuel's protocols showed immediate signs of biological activity. Soil chemistry improved dramatically within days. Seeds that should have taken weeks to germinate were sprouting in 48 hours. Most remarkably, the new plantings seemed to be communicating with surviving forest fragments, establishing root connections and sharing resources at rates that defied conventional understanding. "This is unprecedented," Elena said, reviewing the data from their monitoring stations. "I've never seen ecosystem recovery happen this fast, but their success also attracted unwanted attention. News of the rapid forest regrowth spread through the local community, bringing visitors, reporters, and eventually people who weren't interested in scientific documentation. Jake was working on expanding the cabin's living space when Marcus called, out from the forest edge. "Dad, we've got company." 3 black SUVs were parked along the access road, and men in tactical gear were setting up what looked like surveillance equipment. They weren't hiding their presence. If anything, they seemed to want Jake and his team to know they were being watched. Elena joined them, binoculars in hand. Private security, the kind that corporations hire when they want to intimidate people without getting their own hands dirty. "Are they on our property?" Jake asked. "Technically, no. They're set up just outside the property line, but the message was clear. Biogenesis wasn't going to wait for court orders. They were applying pressure, making it clear that Jake and his supporters were under constant surveillance. That evening, Rose arrived with disturbing news from the tribal council. "Biogenesis representatives met with our leadership yesterday," she reported. "They offered the tribe a substantial development contract. Casino expansion, new tourist facilities, job creation programs, in exchange for withdrawing our support for your father's research." "What did the council say?" Elena asked. "We sent them away, but they'll be back, probably with larger offers and more pressure. Some of our younger council members are already asking whether protecting your father's work is worth giving up potential economic opportunities for our people." Jake felt the walls closing in around them. Corporate surveillance, federal investigations, legal challenges, and now attempts to divide their supporters by offering competing economic incentives. Biogenesis was using every tool in their arsenal to acquire Samuel's research. But that night, as they reviewed their progress and planned the next phase of restoration work, Tommy made an observation that changed Jake's perspective on their situation. "They're afraid," he said simply. "Who's afraid?" Marcus asked. "Biogenesis, the federal agents, all of them. If they were confident they could just take your father's research through legal channels, they wouldn't be using intimidation tactics. The fact that they're working so hard to stop us means they know we're succeeding." Elena looked up from the monitoring data she'd been reviewing. "He's right. Look at these numbers. In 1 week, we've demonstrated forest recovery rates that should be impossible. If we can sustain this progress for another month, we'll have created something that can't be ignored or suppressed." Rose nodded slowly. "Traditional ecological knowledge teaches us that the earth wants to heal itself. What your father discovered was how to remove the obstacles to that natural healing. But what you're all discovering now is that the biggest obstacles aren't technical, they're political and economic." Jake walked over to the window that looked out over their restoration area. Even in the darkness, he could see the monitoring, station lights blinking steadily, recording the accelerated growth that was transforming burned wasteland into thriving forest. "So we keep working," he said. "We document everything. We expand the restoration area as fast as we can, and we make sure that the success is so visible, so undeniable, that it becomes politically impossible to suppress." "And if they get a court order to shut us down?" Marcus asked. Jake turned back to his son, seeing in the boy's face the same determination that had driven Samuel Harrison to spend 20 years developing revolutionary restoration technology. "Then we make sure the knowledge is preserved and shared no matter what happens to us personally." Over the following days, their work took on an urgency that bordered on desperation. They knew that legal challenges were coming, that federal agents would return with broader authority, that corporate pressure would continue to escalate. But they also knew that every day they gained, every acre they successfully restored, made it harder for their opponents to claim that Samuel's work was dangerous or ineffective. Elena established connections with environmental journalists, sharing data and photographs that documented the unprecedented recovery rates. Rose coordinated with indigenous rights organizations, framing the battle as an attempt by corporations to appropriate traditional ecological knowledge. Tommy worked with other young tribal members to create social media campaigns that brought national attention to their restoration efforts, and Jake focused on what he did best: building not just the physical infrastructure needed to support their restoration work, but also the community of supporters who understood what they were fighting for and why it mattered. But as the second week came to an end, they received news that changed everything. Elena's contact at the county courthouse called with a warning. Federal marshals would arrive in the morning with court orders authorizing seizure of Samuel's research materials and quarantine of the restoration areas. How long do we have?" Jake asked. "Maybe 12 hours, Elena said. "Probably less." That night, as they worked frantically to secure the most crucial research data and prepare for what might be their final confrontation with federal authority, Jake found himself thinking about his father's letter. Samuel had written about trusting Jake to understand the responsibility of stewardship, to protect the knowledge from exploitation. As dawn approached and they heard the distant sound of vehicles moving through the forest, Jake realized that the real test wasn't whether they could continue Samuel's research. It was whether they could ensure that the knowledge survived, no matter what happened to them. The federal marshals arrived at dawn with a convoy that included hazmat teams, environmental specialists, and enough legal documentation to justify almost any action they chose to take. But what Jake hadn't expected was to find his own son standing in the doorway of Samuel's underground laboratory, holding a video camera and speaking with calm authority that belied his 17 years. "My name is Marcus Harrison," he was saying to the camera. "I'm the grandson of Dr. Samuel Harrison, the environmental scientist whose research these federal agents are about to confiscate. I want the world to know what's really happening here." Elena stood behind him, documenting the federal seizure with her own recording equipment. Tommy and Rose flanked the entrance to the restoration chamber, their presence both protective and symbolic. They had transformed what could have been a quiet government seizure into a very public confrontation. Agent Martinez looked frustrated as he approached Jake. "Mr. Harrison, we have federal court orders authorizing the quarantine of this facility and seizure of all research materials. I need you and your associates to evacuate immediately." "This is private property," Jake replied, aware that his words were being recorded. "And you're seizing research that was conducted independently by a private citizen on his own land. Mr. Harrison, your father's research involves potentially dangerous biological agents that require federal oversight. Show me the evidence." Elena interjected, stepping forward with a tablet loaded with Samuel's research data. "I'm a licensed botanist with the Forest Service. I've reviewed every aspect of Dr. Harrison's work, and there are no genetically modified organisms, no dangerous biological agents, and no violations of federal biotech regulations." Agent Martinez consulted his own documents. "Our analysis suggests otherwise." "Based on what data? What independent analysis? Or are you relying on information provided by Biogenesis Corporation?" The question clearly struck home. Agent Martinez's hesitation was brief but telling, long, enough for the cameras to capture his uncertainty, and for Jake to realize that Elena had identified their opponent's weakness. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Martinez said finally, "I need you to step aside so our technical team can secure the facility. I'll step aside when you provide evidence that Dr. Harrison's work poses any actual danger to public health or environmental safety." What followed was a standoff that lasted 3 hours and attracted national media attention. Elena's scientific credentials and calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the federal agent's inability to provide concrete evidence of danger. Tommy's knowledge of traditional ecological practices exposed the cultural bias in federal regulations that treated indigenous land management techniques as suspicious technology. Rose's legal understanding of tribal sovereignty rights created jurisdictional complications that the federal team hadn't anticipated. But most importantly, Marcus's decision to document and broadcast the confrontation transformed a bureaucratic seizure into a public debate about corporate influence, environmental protection, and government overreach. By noon, the clearing around Samuel's property was filled with reporters, environmental activists, tribal supporters, and local residents who had come to witness what was being described on social media as a David and Goliath battle over forest restoration technology. "Mr. Harrison," called a reporter from the Sacramento Bee, "what do you think your father would say about this situation?" Jake looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at the federal agents who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the public attention, at his son who was still documenting everything with determined professionalism. "I think he'd be proud that his research is being defended by people who understand that some knowledge belongs to everyone, not just to corporations with the best lawyers." Agent Martinez made one more attempt to assert federal authority. "Mr. Harrison, regardless of public opinion, we have legal authority to secure this facility." Agent Martinez. Rose stepped forward, holding a document that she'd been keeping in reserve. "I'm serving you with a tribal court injunction. This research was conducted in partnership with the Yurok Nation under our sovereignty rights. Any federal seizure would violate our treaty obligations. The legal complexity was becoming unmanageable. Federal authority, state property rights, tribal sovereignty, corporate patent claims, and environmental protection regulations were all colliding in ways that none of the federal agents had anticipated. But the real turning point came when Tommy made a simple observation that cut through all the legal maneuvering. "Agent Martinez," he said quietly, "walk with me through the restoration area. Let me show you what Dr. Harrison's research has actually accomplished." Something in the young man's voice, perhaps its complete lack of confrontation or challenge, seemed to reach the federal agent. After a moment's hesitation, Martinez followed Tommy into the forest. What he saw there was undeniable evidence of ecological healing on a scale that defied conventional understanding. Areas that had been barren wasteland 2 weeks ago were now thriving with diverse plant communities. Soil that had been damaged by fire was showing signs of complete recovery. Wildlife was returning to areas where it shouldn't have been viable for years. "This is impossible," Martinez said, kneeling to examine young trees that looked healthy enough to be several years old. "No," Tommy replied, "it's just unusual. Dr. Harrison learned to work with natural processes instead of against them. Everything you see here is the result of removing obstacles to the forest's own healing ability." Elena had followed them with her recording equipment, ensuring that the agent's amazement was documented. "Agent Martinez, what you're looking at is the most successful forest restoration project in North American history. The question isn't whether it's dangerous. The question is whether we can afford not to implement these techniques everywhere they're needed." When they returned to the crowd of officials, reporters and supporters, Agent Martinez faced a choice that would define not just the immediate situation, but the broader conflict between corporate interests and environmental protection. "Dr. Vasquez," he said finally, "I need a full scientific assessment of Dr. Harrison's methods and results. Can you provide documentation that would satisfy federal environmental safety requirements?" "I can provide documentation that will prove this. Research represents the most important advance in ecological restoration in 50 years. That afternoon, while federal agents consulted with their supervisors and biogenesis lawyers worked frantically to salvage their seizure strategy, Jake received an unexpected phone call. It was Linda. and her voice carried a tone he hadn't heard since before their divorce, respect mixed with something that might have been pride. "Jake, I've been watching the news coverage of what's happening up there. Marcus looks—" She paused, searching for words. "He looks like a young man who knows exactly what he's fighting for." "He does," Jake agreed. "I still think you're crazy for taking on a fight this big. But I also think—" Another pause. "I think maybe crazy is what the situation requires." It was the closest thing to an apology or admission of error that Linda had ever offered, and Jake found himself unexpectedly moved by her words. "Linda, if something happens to me, if this goes badly, nothing's going to happen to you," she interrupted. "Because Marcus needs his father, and that boy has gotten very good at making sure he gets what he needs." That evening, as federal agents withdrew to reconsider their options and reporters filed stories about the confrontation, Jake sat in his father's laboratory, surrounded by the research that had started this entire conflict. Samuel's personal video recordings were stored on a secure server, but Jake had never had the emotional strength to watch them. Now, facing the possibility that the research might be seized or destroyed, he felt ready to hear his father's final words. The first recording was dated 3 years before Samuel's death. He looked older than Jake remembered, his hair white and his face lined with years of work and worry. But his eyes held the intensity that Jake recognized from his own childhood, the passion for discovery that had always been Samuel's defining characteristic. "Jacob," his father's recorded voice said, using the formal name that had always created distance between them. "If you're watching this, it means I've failed to complete the work that has consumed the last 20 years of my life. More importantly, it means I've failed to bridge the distance I created between us after your mother died." Jake's throat tightened as Samuel continued. "I know you believe I withdrew from your life because I found my research more important than my son. The truth is more painful. After Margaret died, I realized that the world we were leaving you might not be habitable for your children. The climate crisis isn't a distant problem, Jacob. It's the defining challenge of your generation." The recording went on to detail Samuel's early research, his growing understanding of ecological restoration, and his decision to refuse corporate funding that would have compromised his work. But it was the personal passages that hit Jake the hardest. "I should have been a better father to you," Samuel said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held decades of regret. "I should have found ways to include you in this work, to help you understand why it mattered so much. Instead, I let my guilt over Margaret's death and my fear about the future drive me into isolation." Marcus had been watching over Jake's shoulder, and now he spoke quietly. "He sounds like you, Dad, when you get passionate about something important." Jake looked at his son, seeing in the boy's face the same intensity that had driven both Samuel Harrison and now Jake himself to fight against overwhelming odds for something larger than personal interests. The final recording was dated just 6 months before Samuel's death. He looked frail, clearly affected by the illness that would eventually kill him, but his voice was strong and his words were directed specifically to Jake and Marcus. "The research is complete," Samuel said. "The restoration protocols work. I have documentation proving that damaged ecosystems can be healed in months rather than decades. But the implications are profound, and I trust you to understand what I've learned, that this knowledge must be protected from those who would use it to justify further destruction." Samuel leaned forward, his eyes intense with the urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time. "Jacob, I'm leaving this research to you, not because you're a scientist, but because you're a father. You understand that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Use this knowledge to heal what my generation has damaged. Protect it from those who would exploit it, and perhaps, in doing so, you can accomplish what I never could: heal the wounds between generations." As the recording ended, Jake felt something shift inside him. The anger and resentment he'd carried for 20 years wasn't gone, but it was transformed into something more useful, a determination to honor his father's legacy while making it his own. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, "tomorrow's going to be the real battle, isn't it?" Jake nodded, looking around the laboratory that represented Samuel's life's work. "Tomorrow, we find out whether this research survives to help heal the world, or whether it gets buried in corporate patents and government regulations." But as they prepared for what might be their final night on the property, Jake realized that something had already changed. The knowledge was no longer contained in one secret laboratory. Elena had copies of all the research. Tommy understood the traditional ecological principles that made the technology work. Rose had ensured that indigenous communities would preserve the cultural knowledge that was essential to the restoration process. Most importantly, Marcus had documented everything, ensuring that the world would know what was at stake and why it mattered. Tomorrow would determine the immediate fate of Samuel's research. But tonight, Jake understood that his father's real legacy wasn't the specific techniques or the underground laboratory. It was the understanding that healing was possible, even after devastating damage, if people were willing to work together towards something larger than their individual interests. The restoration had already begun. The real shock came not from federal agents or corporate lawyers, but from a quiet woman in a government sedan who arrived alone at dawn, carrying credentials that made Agent Martinez's authority look insignificant. Dr. Sarah Chen identified herself as a senior analyst with the Department of Defense's Environmental Security Initiative, and the documents she presented carried classification levels that Jake had never seen outside of spy movies. When she asked to speak privately with him, Elena and Rose, Agent Martinez didn't object. He simply stepped aside with the deference of someone who recognized genuine authority. "Mr. Harrison," Dr. Chen said as they gathered in Samuel's laboratory, "your father's research has been classified as a matter of national security, not because it's dangerous, but because it's potentially the most strategically important scientific development of the 21st century. Jake felt the ground shifting beneath him. National security, climate change isn't just an environmental issue, Mr. Harrison. It's a strategic threat that will reshape global power structures within our lifetime. Nations that can restore damaged ecosystems will have enormous advantages in food security, resource management, and population stability. Nations that can't will face increasing instability, conflict, and collapse." Elena leaned forward, her scientific mind grappling with the implications. "You're saying that restoration technology is a military asset?" "I'm saying that the ability to rapidly restore forest cover, agricultural productivity, and watershed functionality represents a form of national power that could be more important than traditional military capabilities." Dr. Chen opened a tablet and displayed satellite imagery that made Jake's breath catch. The photos showed forest restoration projects in China, Brazil, and Northern Europe, all using techniques that looked remarkably similar to Samuel's protocols. "Your father wasn't the only scientist working on accelerated restoration technology," she continued, "but he was the most successful. His methods achieve results that our international competitors can't match. The question is whether the United States will maintain that technological advantage." Rose had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with the gravity of someone who had seen such conversations before. "Dr. Chen, are you telling us that the federal government wants to weaponize restoration technology?" "I'm telling you that other governments already are. Chinese forest restoration projects in Africa aren't just about environmental protection, they're about establishing resource extraction rights and political influence. Russian reforestation efforts in Siberia are designed to support military infrastructure development. European restoration programs are being used to control migration patterns and agricultural production." Jake felt sick as he understood what he was hearing. "You want to turn my father's healing technology into another form of conquest?" Mr. Harrison, I want to make sure that your father's healing technology is used by people who share his values, not by authoritarian governments that see environmental restoration as just another tool of control. The distinction felt crucial, but Jake wasn't sure he trusted it. What exactly are you proposing? Dr. Chen closed her tablet and looked directly at Jake, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of classified knowledge he couldn't imagine. Your father's research represents approximately 15 years of development that would cost billions of dollars to replicate. Biogenesis Corporation has been working with foreign investors to acquire that technology for international deployment. If they succeed, the United States loses strategic capabilities that took 2 decades to develop. And if they don't succeed, then we need to ensure that the technology remains under U.S. control while being implemented for genuinely beneficial purposes. Elena's expression was skeptical. Dr. Chen, how do we know that government control would be any better than corporate control? You don't, Dr. Chen admitted. But you do know that your father spent 20 years refusing to work with corporations because he understood the risks of commercialization. What you may not know is that he also refused several approaches from foreign governments who wanted to acquire his research. Jake felt another piece of his understanding shift. Foreign governments approached my father, Chinese agricultural research institutes, European environmental agencies, Russian resource development programs. The complete reforestation protocol manual that Jake discovered the next morning changed everything he thought he understood about his father's work and the scope of the battle they were fighting. He found it in the deepest section of Samuel's laboratory, sealed in a climate-controlled vault that required both the wooden key Rose had given him and a biometric scanner that somehow recognized Jake's handprint despite never having been programmed with his data. The manual itself was a masterpiece of integrated knowledge, 300 pages of detailed technical specifications, traditional ecological wisdom, implementation strategies, and philosophical reflections on the ethics of environmental healing. But it was the appendix that made Jake's hands shake as he read. Samuel had documented every approach he'd received from governments, corporations, and international organizations over the past 15 years. The list was staggering. Agricultural conglomerates from Brazil, mining companies from Australia, forestry operations from Canada, and government agencies from nearly every major power on Earth. More disturbing were the sums they'd offered. The Chinese Agricultural Ministry had proposed a partnership worth $2 billion. A consortium of European environmental groups had offered 3 billion-plus research facilities in Switzerland and Germany. Biogenesis, despite being one of the smaller players, had been the most persistent, making 17 separate offers. Over 8 years, and all of them had been refused. Elena, Jake called, his voice echoing in the underground chamber. You need to see this. She joined him at the vault, followed quickly by Marcus, Tommy, and Rose. As Jake spread the manuals, contents across Samuel's main workstation, they began to understand the true magnitude of what they had inherited. Your father wasn't just developing restoration technology, Elena said, studying the comprehensive implementation strategies. He was developing a complete alternative to industrial land management. These protocols could replace clear-cutting, strip mining, intensive agriculture, essentially all the major forms of environmental destruction that drive modern economies. Tommy was examining the traditional knowledge sections with obvious awe. He documented 50 years of tribal ecological practices, plant relationships, seasonal cycles, soil management techniques. This represents the collective wisdom of dozens of indigenous communities. Rose nodded, tears evident in her eyes. He spent 10 years learning from our elders, not just recording their knowledge, but understanding how it fit together into a complete system of land stewardship. But Marcus was focused on a different section, detailed analyses of international climate projections and their strategic implications. "Dad, look at this," he said, pointing to a series of maps that showed global temperature changes, sea level rise, and agricultural productivity projections for the next 50 years. Grandpa wasn't just trying to heal damaged forests. He was trying to prepare for climate catastrophe. Jake studied the projections, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. According to Samuel's analysis, current climate change trajectories would make large portions of the Earth uninhabitable within 30 years. Traditional restoration methods would be completely inadequate to address damage occurring at unprecedented scales. But Samuel's protocols could restore ecosystem functionality even under extreme climate stress. Forests that could establish and thrive despite rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and increased wildfire frequency. Agricultural systems that could maintain productivity despite soil degradation and weather instability. Watershed restoration that could provide freshwater security even as traditional sources became unreliable. This isn't just restoration technology, Jake realized. It's survival technology. Elena was reading through Samuel's strategic projections with growing alarm. He calculated that nations with effective restoration capabilities would be able to maintain stable populations and economies despite climate disruption. Nations without those capabilities would face social collapse, resource wars, and massive refugee crises. The implications were staggering. Samuel's research wasn't just valuable. It represented the difference between civilization and chaos in a climate-disrupted world. But as they absorbed the magnitude of what Samuel had developed, they were interrupted by urgent sounds from the surface. Vehicles, shouting voices, and what sounded like construction equipment. Tommy reached the surface first, followed by the others. What they found made Jake's stomach drop. A small army of workers was setting up a perimeter fence around the entire property, while security guards in tactical gear took positions at key access points. Corporate logos on the equipment identified the operation as a joint effort between Biogenesis and something called Global Resource Security. David Kellerman stood near the command trailer, speaking into a satellite phone with the satisfied expression of someone whose long-term planning was finally paying off. "Mr. Harrison," he called out as Jake approached, "I'm afraid there's been a change in your legal status." A man in an expensive suit stepped forward, identifying himself as Attorney Morrison from Kellerman's legal team. "Mr. Harrison, Biogenesis Corporation has successfully obtained an international intellectual property injunction based on technology transfer violations and corporate espionage charges." "Corporate espionage?" Elena stepped forward, her scientific credibility lending weight to her challenge. "Dr. Harrison's research was conducted independently on his own property. Dr. Vasquez, our investigation has revealed that Dr. Harrison's so-called independent research incorporated proprietary methodologies developed by Biogenesis and several international research partners. The restoration protocols represent unauthorized use of patented biotechnology." Jake felt the legal trap closing around them with professional precision. "What biotechnology? My father's work is based on traditional ecological knowledge and selective breeding techniques that have been used for thousands of years. Traditional techniques enhanced with genetic markers and soil treatments that were developed in corporate research facilities," Morrison replied smoothly. "The integration of those enhancements with indigenous knowledge creates derivative works that violate existing patent protections." Tommy looked confused. "That doesn't make sense. Traditional knowledge can't be patented." "Traditional knowledge can't be patented," Morrison agreed. "But enhanced versions of traditional knowledge can be, especially when the enhancements involve proprietary biotechnology." Rose stepped forward with the authority that came from decades of defending tribal rights. "Attorney Morrison, the Yurok Nation holds sovereign rights over traditional ecological knowledge shared with Dr. Harrison. Any attempt to claim corporate ownership of that knowledge violates federal treaty obligations." "Mrs. Crow Feather, our Legal analysis indicates that Dr. Harrison's research represents a commercial exploitation of traditional knowledge that exceeds the scope of legitimate educational or cultural sharing. The legal complexities were becoming labyrinthine, but Jake could see the underlying strategy. Biogenesis had created a situation where Samuel's research could be claimed as corporate property, regardless of its actual origins or development process. But before the legal arguments could continue, they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen and a convoy of federal vehicles that dwarfed Biogenesis's corporate operation. "Mr. Kellerman," Dr. Chen announced as she approached, "I'm afraid your corporate security operation is interfering with a federal investigation of national security implications." Kellerman's confident expression faltered. "Dr. Chen, we have valid court orders authorizing seizure of stolen corporate property, and I have federal authority that supersedes corporate court orders when national security is involved." What followed was a legal standoff that attracted media attention from around the world. Biogenesis claimed corporate ownership of research worth billions of dollars. The federal government claimed national security interests that overrode corporate property rights. The Yurok nation claimed tribal sovereignty over traditional knowledge that couldn't be owned by anyone. And in the middle of it all, Jake found himself holding the key to technology that could determine whether human civilization survived the climate crisis. As the afternoon wore on and legal teams argued jurisdiction while reporters documented every detail, Marcus made a suggestion that cut through all the complexity. "What if we just implement the protocols?" he asked quietly. "Right now, while everyone's arguing about who owns the research, why don't we use it?" Elena looked up from the corporate legal documents she'd been reviewing. "Marcus, what do you mean?" "I mean, we have the manual. We understand the techniques. We've already proven that the technology works. Instead of fighting over who gets to control it, why don't we just start using it to restore as much damaged land as we can?" Tommy's eyes lit up with understanding. "A demonstration so large and successful that it becomes politically impossible to suppress." Rose nodded slowly. "Traditional wisdom says that the best way to win a fight over resources is to make sure everyone has enough resources." Jake looked around at his team. The botanist, the tribal elder, the young man with special insights, and his own son who kept finding ways to see clearly through complicated situations. They had Samuel's complete research. They understood both the science and the traditional knowledge. They had documented proof that the restoration protocols worked. And while corporate lawyers and federal agents argued over jurisdiction, the burned forest around them was continuing to heal at impossible rates. "How long would it take?" Jake asked. "Elena, to restore what?" "Everything. The entire burned area. Enough restored forest to prove that the technology works on a scale that can't be ignored or suppressed." Elena consulted the manual's implementation timelines. "With the protocols your father developed, and enough people working together, 6 months to restore 300 acres. Maybe less if we can get community support. And how long before the legal challenges shut us down? Maybe 2 weeks. Rose said grimly, "Maybe less now that federal authority and corporate interests are both involved." Jake made his decision with the clarity that comes from finally understanding what his father had been preparing him for. This wasn't just about restoration technology or corporate patents or national security. It was about whether the next generation would inherit a world capable of healing or a world that had forgotten how to heal itself. "Then we work faster than the lawyers can argue," he said. "We implement Samuel's protocols across the entire property and document everything. We create success so visible and undeniable that it becomes more valuable than corporate profits or government control." Marcus grinned with the enthusiasm of youth facing a challenge that seemed impossible but felt necessary. "Dad, are you saying we're going to restore a forest while corporations and governments fight over who owns the right to do it? I'm saying we're going to show the world what restoration looks like when it's done for healing instead of profit." As evening approached and they prepared for what would either be their greatest success or their final stand, Jake realized that his father's real gift hadn't been the research itself. It had been the understanding that some knowledge belongs to everyone, and that the best way to protect it is to use it for its intended purpose. The restoration was about to become a revolution. The master seed bank that Jake discovered hidden in Samuel's deepest vault contained the genetic future of North American forest ecosystems, thousands of enhanced seeds representing every major forest type from the Pacific Northwest to the Appalachian Mountains, each one engineered to establish and thrive under the extreme conditions of a climate-changed world. But as Jake, Elena, Tommy, and Marcus prepared to implement the most ambitious restoration effort in human history, they found themselves facing a confrontation that transcended legal arguments and corporate interests. At dawn, the property was surrounded by a coalition that Jake had never imagined possible. Biogenesis security forces maintained their perimeter, but they were now flanked by federal agents, tribal police, environmental activists, international observers, and what appeared to be private military contractors whose allegiances weren't entirely clear. More disturbing were the drones, dozens of them, ranging from news media units to sophisticated surveillance platforms that suggested multiple government agencies were monitoring the situation in real time. "This is insane," Elena said, reviewing the morning's intelligence briefing that Dr. Chen had shared. "We're talking about forest restoration, not nuclear weapons. Forest restoration that could shift global power balances within a generation," Dr. Chen replied. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to understand that what happens here today will influence international climate policy for decades." Jake looked out over the restoration area, where young trees were already showing the impossible growth rates that had attracted all this attention. In the morning light, the healing forest looked like hope made visible, but surrounded by competing interests that saw it as a strategic asset, it also looked like a battlefield. "Dr. Chen, what happens if we refuse to cooperate with anyone? If we just focus on the restoration work and let the lawyers sort out the ownership questions later, then you'll likely be arrested by someone. Federal agents, corporate security, or international enforcement teams. The research is too valuable for any of the competing interests to risk losing control." Marcus had been unusually quiet during the morning preparations, but now he spoke with the seriousness of someone who had thought carefully about impossible choices. "What if we make it impossible for anyone to control the research?" Tommy looked up from the seed preparation work they'd been doing. "What do you mean? I mean, what if we release everything? The complete manual, all the research data, the traditional knowledge documentation, everything Grandpa spent 20 years developing, make it freely available to everyone so no one can claim exclusive ownership." Elena's eyes widened as she understood the implications. Open source restoration technology. "More than that," Marcus continued, "we implement the protocols right here, right now, in front of all these cameras and observers. We create a live demonstration that everyone can document, replicate, and adapt to their own local conditions." Rose had been listening with the careful attention of someone who recognized wisdom when she heard it. In traditional culture, knowledge that serves healing belongs to the community, not to individuals. Your grandfather understood this. That's why he worked so hard to integrate indigenous knowledge with modern science. Jake felt something click into place as he understood what his son was proposing. It wasn't just about defeating corporate claims or satisfying government interests. It was about fulfilling Samuel's actual intention for the research. "How would we do it?" he asked. Elena was already working on her tablet, accessing the communication networks they'd established with environmental organizations around the world. "We have contacts at universities, environmental groups, tribal communities, and government agencies in 43 countries. We could simultaneously release the research documentation while implementing it here." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. And if multiple groups around the world start using the protocols at the same time, it becomes impossible for any single entity to claim control or stop the implementation. Dr. Chen had been listening with obvious alarm. Mr. Harrison, what you're describing would essentially end U.S. technological advantages in restoration science. Other nations would have immediate access to research that cost billions of dollars to develop. Dr. Chen, what we're describing would give every nation the tools they need to survive climate change. That seems more important than technological advantages. As they discussed the logistics of global knowledge sharing while implementing local restoration, they were interrupted by a commotion near the corporate security perimeter. A group of younger tribal members had arrived, carrying traditional tools and singing in Yurok language as they approached the restoration area. Leading them was a woman Jake hadn't met, perhaps 30 years old, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to leadership and the traditional regalia of someone honoring cultural protocols. "That's my daughter," Rose said with obvious pride. "Sarah Crowfeather. She coordinates environmental programs for the Tribal Council." Sarah approached with the measured pace of someone who understood the significance of the moment. When she reached Jake, she extended her hand with the respect of one leader acknowledging another. "Mr. Harrison, my mother tells me you've chosen to honor your father's commitment to healing rather than profit. Our community has come to help you complete the work." Behind her, more than 50 tribal members were setting up what looked like a traditional work camp, cooking facilities, tool preparation areas, and ceremonial spaces that suggested they were prepared for an extended effort. "Sarah, this could get dangerous," Jake warned. "There are a lot of competing interests here, and not all of them are friendly to tribal sovereignty. Mr. Harrison, our people have been healing damaged land for thousands of years. We understand the risks of protecting knowledge that serves the earth instead of those who would exploit it." As the tribal work group began implementing restoration protocols with an efficiency that impressed even Elena, corporate and government observers found themselves witnessing something they hadn't anticipated: traditional ecological knowledge being applied at scale with modern tools and documented with scientific precision. The morning's work accomplished more ecosystem restoration than most projects achieved in months. Areas that had been barren ash just hours before were showing signs of biological activity. Soil treatments developed from Samuel's research were creating conditions for accelerated plant establishment. Most remarkably, the new plantings were immediately beginning to establish the complex root relationships that would support long-term forest health. But the real breakthrough came when Marcus began live streaming the restoration work, providing real-time documentation and instruction that allowed viewers around the world to understand and potentially replicate what they were seeing. "This is Marcus Harrison," he said to his camera, speaking with the confidence of someone who had found his calling. "I'm documenting the implementation of my grandfather's restoration protocols, techniques that can heal damaged ecosystems in months instead of decades. Everything we're doing here can be adapted to local conditions and implemented by communities anywhere in the world." Within hours, the live stream was being watched by millions of viewers and translated into dozens of languages. More importantly, environmental scientists and restoration practitioners around the world were taking detailed notes and beginning to test the techniques in their own local contexts. Elena monitored the global response with amazement. "Jake, we're getting implementation reports from Australia, Kenya, Scotland, and Chile. People are actually using the protocols in real time as we demonstrate them." But the global attention also attracted more ominous responses. Corporate legal teams were filing injunctions in multiple jurisdictions. Government agencies were issuing warnings about unauthorized biotechnology transfer. International trade organizations were claiming violations of technology export restrictions. The confrontation was escalating beyond anything Jake had imagined, But the restoration work was also succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections. The forest wasn't just healing, it was becoming a living demonstration that environmental damage could be reversed quickly and effectively if the right knowledge was applied with community cooperation. As afternoon approached and tensions continued to build between competing interests, Jake realized that they had reached a point where retreat was no longer possible. The world was watching, the forest was healing, and the future of restoration technology would be determined by what happened in the next few hours. "Elena," he said, "how much of Samuel's research have we shared so far?" "Maybe 30% of the technical protocols. None of the advanced implementation strategies or the theoretical framework that explains why the techniques work. And how much would we need to share to make the knowledge impossible to suppress?" Elena consulted her tablet, reviewing the global response data. "If we release the complete manual, everything your father documented, within the next hour, there will be enough copies distributed globally that no legal or corporate action could prevent implementation." Jake looked around at the community that had formed around Samuel's work: tribal members applying traditional knowledge, scientists documenting unprecedented results, young people sharing hope with a global audience, and federal agents who seemed increasingly uncertain about whether they were protecting or threatening something essential to human survival. The choice his father had left him was becoming clear. It wasn't about who controlled the research. It was about ensuring that the knowledge served its intended purpose of healing the world. "Do it," Jake said. "Release everything." The global patent release document that Jake signed at 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time, witnessed by cameras from around the world and representatives of multiple governments, formally released all rights to Samuel Harrison's restoration technology to humanity as a whole, ensuring that no corporation, government, or individual could ever claim exclusive ownership of knowledge that belonged to the Earth itself. But signing the document was the easy part. The hard part was the confrontation that erupted immediately afterward, as corporate and government interests realized that 20 years of strategic planning had just been undermined by a man who chose healing over control. David Kellerman's reaction was swift and furious. Within minutes of Jake's signature, Biogenesis security forces began moving toward the restoration area, apparently intending to physically prevent further implementation of the protocols. "Mr. Harrison," Kellerman called out as armed security. Guards flanked him. "That document has no legal validity. You cannot release patents on technology that you don't own." "Mr. Kellerman," Jake replied, holding up the patent release while Marcus continued streaming live. "My father's research is being implemented right now by communities in 47 countries. Whether or not you recognize the legal validity of this document, the knowledge is already beyond anyone's ability to control." Agent Martinez stepped forward, clearly caught between competing federal directives. "Mr. Harrison, the Department of Agriculture has serious concerns about unauthorized international technology transfer." "Agent Martinez," Elena interjected, consulting her tablet, "we've been monitoring global implementation for the past 6 hours. The restoration protocols are being successfully adapted to local conditions in ecosystems from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. This isn't technology transfer, this is ecological healing." Dr. Chen had been coordinating with federal supervisors throughout the day, and now she approached with what looked like resignation mixed with relief. "Mr. Harrison, I've been instructed to inform you that the Department of Defense is withdrawing its claim to your father's research. The strategic value of exclusive access is outweighed by the global benefits of open implementation." The statement seemed to surprise everyone, including Agent Martinez. "Dr. Chen, what about national security implications?" Agent Martinez, "Our analysis indicates that climate stability is a more pressing national security concern than technological advantages. If Dr. Harrison's protocols can accelerate global ecosystem restoration, that serves U.S. interests regardless of who controls the implementation. But Kellerman wasn't finished. This is irrelevant. Biogenesis Corporation will pursue legal remedies. In international courts, we will seek damages for theft of intellectual property, violations of technology export restrictions, and interference with legitimate business interests. Tommy looked up from the restoration work he'd been coordinating with tribal volunteers. Mr. Kellerman, how do you sue the entire planet for using knowledge that was freely given? It was Rose who provided the answer that cut through all the legal complexity. In traditional law, knowledge that serves healing cannot be owned because healing is a responsibility that belongs to everyone. Your grandfather understood this. That's why he developed the research in partnership with indigenous communities rather than in corporate laboratories. Sarah Crow Feather stepped forward, holding a document that she'd been preparing while the legal arguments continued. Mr. Kellerman, the Yurok Nation is formally declaring Dr. Samuel Harrison's research to be traditional ecological knowledge under our sovereignty rights. Any attempt to claim corporate ownership will be treated as an attack on tribal cultural property. The legal sophistication of the tribal response seemed to catch corporate representatives off guard. They had prepared for federal regulations and international courts, but not for indigenous sovereignty rights that predated all other legal frameworks. Marcus had been documenting the confrontation while continuing to provide restoration instruction to his global audience, but now he stepped forward with the moral clarity of someone who had grown up watching adults complicate simple truths. Mr. Kellerman, look around you, he said, gesturing toward the restoration area where forest recovery was visible in real time. This is what healing looks like. My grandfather spent 20 years developing this technology to repair damage caused by people who thought they could own the earth. Are you really going to spend the next 20 years trying to own the solutions? The question hung in the air like a challenge that transcended legal arguments and corporate strategies. In the afternoon light, the restored forest provided a backdrop that made the answer obvious to everyone watching. Millions of people around the world who were seeing damaged ecosystems heal at impossible rates. Elena had been monitoring global implementation reports, and now she shared data that transformed the entire conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm receiving confirmation that Dr. Harrison's restoration protocols have been successfully implemented on 6 continents in the past 8 hours. Forest restoration projects in Scotland are showing 400% growth rates. Agricultural recovery programs in Kenya are restoring soil fertility in days instead of years. Watershed restoration efforts in Chile are re-establishing stream flows that were lost to mining damage. Dr. Chen consulted her secure communications device. Mr. Harrison, I'm receiving reports that the European Union, the African Development Bank, and the United Nations Environment Programme are all requesting immediate access to your father's complete research documentation. They want to implement restoration programs at continental scales. Jake felt the magnitude of what was happening settle around him like Samuel's coat, too large for any individual to wear comfortably, but somehow fitting when understood as collective responsibility. Dr. Chen, they can have everything. The complete manual, all the research data, the traditional knowledge documentation. Everything my father developed is now available to anyone who wants to use it for healing instead of exploitation. As if summoned by his words, representatives from multiple international organizations began arriving throughout the afternoon. Scientists from the Global Forest Recovery Initiative, administrators from the International Climate Restoration Fund, coordinators from indigenous communities around the world who wanted to integrate traditional knowledge with Samuel's scientific innovations. But the most significant arrival was A delegation from the United Nations Climate Restoration Commission, led by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Amara Okafor, the Commission's Director of Ecosystem Recovery. "Mr. Harrison," she said, extending her hand with the respect of one environmental advocate greeting another, "your father's research represents the most important advance in ecological restoration in human history. The United Nations is prepared to support global implementation with funding, technical assistance, and international legal protection." Kellerman made one final attempt to assert corporate interests. Dr. Okafor, Biogenesis Corporation maintains that this research represents stolen intellectual property that cannot be legally transferred without our consent. Dr. Okafor studied the corporate representative with the patience of someone who had spent decades navigating international environmental politics. "Mr. Kellerman, the United Nations recognizes indigenous sovereignty rights over traditional ecological knowledge. If Dr. Harrison's research incorporates such knowledge with tribal consent, corporate patent claims become legally invalid under international law." The corporate legal strategy was collapsing in real time, but Jake realized that the real victory wasn't legal, it was practical. Around the world, communities were already using Samuel's restoration protocols to heal damaged ecosystems. The knowledge was spreading faster than any legal system could track, being adapted to local conditions and implemented by people who understood that healing couldn't wait for corporate approval. As evening approached and the confrontation reached its climax, Marcus provided the moment of clarity that resolved everything. He had been live streaming for nearly 10 hours, documenting not just the restoration work, but the entire conflict between corporate interests and community healing. "I want to show everyone something," he said to his global audience, walking toward the area where they had first discovered Samuel's carved stone marker. "This is where it all started. My grandfather left us this land, but more than that, he left us a choice about what legacy means." He knelt beside the stone marker, his camera capturing the ancient symbols carved into its surface, alongside the fresh growth that surrounded it. New trees establishing root systems, soil recovering its biological complexity, an entire ecosystem remembering how to heal itself. "Corporate lawyers want to own this knowledge because they think ownership creates value," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found his truth. "But my grandfather understood that some knowledge becomes more valuable when it's shared. The forest doesn't heal because someone owns it. It heals because everyone who touches it understands their responsibility to help it grow." Jake watched his son speak to the world with pride that went beyond parental satisfaction. Marcus had become something that Jake was still learning to be, a steward of knowledge that served healing rather than profit. Elena stepped beside Jake, consulting her tablet one final time. "The global implementation has reached critical mass," she reported quietly. "Over 300 restoration projects on 6 continents are now using your father's protocols. Even if corporate legal challenges succeed in the United States, the knowledge is preserved and protected by international implementation." Tommy joined them, grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had helped accomplish something impossible. The traditional knowledge holders are particularly excited. Indigenous communities from Australia to Alaska are reporting that the restoration protocols integrate perfectly with their own land management practices. Rose approached with the dignity of someone who had witnessed both the completion of important work and the beginning of even more important work. "Your father would be proud, Jake. He developed the science, but you found the wisdom to share it properly." As corporate representatives realized that their legal strategies had been outmaneuvered by global community action, and government agents recognized that national security was better served by international cooperation than technological competition. The confrontation transformed into something unprecedented, a celebration of successful environmental healing. Dr. Chen approached Jake with news from Washington. "Mr. Harrison, The federal government is withdrawing all claims to your father's research. The President's science advisors have concluded that global implementation serves U.S. interests better than exclusive control. Agent Martinez added information from his own supervisors. Additionally, the Department of Agriculture is offering federal support for expanding restoration protocols to damaged public lands. If you're interested in continuing this work, there's funding available for large-scale implementation. But it was Dr. Okafor who provided the most significant news. Mr. Harrison, the United Nations is prepared to offer you and your team positions coordinating global restoration efforts. Your father's research has created possibilities for ecosystem recovery that we never imagined achievable. Jake looked around at the community that had formed around Samuel's work. Scientists documenting unprecedented results. Tribal members applying traditional knowledge, young people sharing hope with a global audience, and international representatives who saw restoration technology as the key to climate survival. The choice that had seemed impossible just days ago now felt inevitable. His father had left him knowledge that was too important to keep and too valuable to sell. The only responsible option was to give it away to everyone who could use it for healing. Dr. Okafor, Jake said, we accept the UN position, but with conditions. The restoration protocols must remain freely available to all communities. Traditional knowledge holders must be recognized as equal partners in all implementation efforts. And corporate interests that prioritize profit over healing must be excluded from decision-making roles. Mr. Harrison, those conditions are exactly why the United Nations wants your leadership. As the sun set over the restored forest, Jake found himself surrounded by people who had become more than allies. They had become the foundation of a global community dedicated to healing damaged ecosystems. Elena would coordinate scientific documentation and adaptation of restoration protocols to different environmental conditions. Tommy would bridge traditional ecological knowledge with modern restoration techniques. Rose would ensure that indigenous sovereignty rights were respected in all international implementation efforts. Marcus would continue sharing the work with global audiences, inspiring young people to see environmental healing as both possible and necessary. And Jake would continue building not just physical structures to support restoration work, but also the relationships and institutions that would ensure Samuel's knowledge served healing instead of exploitation. But the most important realization came as Jake walked through the restoration area one final time before heading to the celebration that the tribal community had organized. The forest wasn't just healing, it was thriving in ways that exceeded even Samuel's most optimistic projections. The integration of traditional knowledge with scientific innovation had created something more powerful than either approach could achieve alone. Standing among trees that had grown from ash to hope in just weeks, Jake understood his father's final gift. It wasn't just restoration technology. It was the understanding that healing required community, that knowledge belonged to everyone, and that the earth would recover from even devastating damage if people were willing to work together for something larger than their immediate interests. The restoration had become a revolution, not through force or conflict, but through the simple power of demonstrating that healing was possible when communities chose cooperation over competition. As he headed toward the celebration, Jake realized that the real work was just beginning. Around the world, damaged ecosystems were waiting for communities who understood that the earth could heal itself if given the right kind of help. Samuel Harrison's legacy would grow like the forest, not because anyone owned it, but because everyone who touched it understood their responsibility to help it flourish. 6 months later, Jake stood in the living memorial garden that had grown where his father's burned forest once lay, watching his grandson take his first steps among trees that represented the future of environmental healing. Marcus had returned from his first semester at UC Berkeley with stories of restoration projects starting on every continent and a fiancée named Sophia, who shared his passion for community-based environmental work. Elena's research was being implemented by the United Nations Climate Restoration Commission in 43 countries. Tommy had become the youngest person ever appointed to coordinate traditional knowledge integration for international restoration efforts, and Rose, at 74, was traveling the world teaching indigenous land management techniques to scientists who were finally ready to learn that the Earth had always known how to heal itself. The memorial garden itself had become something beyond anyone's original vision. What had started as 300 acres of fire-damaged forest was now a thriving ecosystem that served as a living laboratory, educational center, and pilgrimage destination for people who wanted to see what restoration looked like when it was done right. More than the physical transformation, though, the garden had become a symbol of what was possible when communities chose healing over exploitation. The carved stone marker that had started everything now stood at the center of a grove where children from around the world came to learn about forest ecology, traditional knowledge, and the responsibility of stewardship. Jake's own life had settled into rhythms that would have been unimaginable just months ago. His relationship with Elena had deepened into the kind of partnership that sustained both personal happiness and shared work that mattered. Their consulting business helped communities around the world implement restoration protocols adapted to local conditions, but they always returned to the memorial garden, which had become both their home and their laboratory. Marcus had found his calling in environmental journalism, documenting restoration successes and failures with the same honesty that had made his live streams during the corporate confrontation so powerful. His documentary about Samuel's work had won international recognition, but more importantly, it had inspired young people in dozens of countries to start their own restoration projects. Even Linda had come to understand, if not fully support, what Jake and Marcus were building. During her visit for the Memorial Garden's dedication ceremony, she had admitted that watching their work succeed had helped her recognize the limitations of measuring success only in financial terms. "I still think you're both crazy," she had said, watching Marcus lead a group of children through the forest while explaining how trees communicate with each other. "But maybe the world needs more people who are crazy in the right direction." The global impact of Samuel's research had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Forest restoration programs using Harrison protocols, as they had come to be known, were showing success rates that transformed how environmental scientists thought about ecosystem recovery. More importantly, the integration of traditional knowledge with modern science had created a new model for environmental research that respected both indigenous wisdom and scientific innovation. Biogenesis Corporation had quietly withdrawn its legal challenges and refocused its business model on supporting community-based restoration efforts, rather than trying to control them. Several other corporations had followed suit, discovering that partnership was more profitable than ownership when dealing with communities that controlled essential knowledge. The federal government had established the Harrison Institute for Restoration Science, with Elena as its first director and funding that supported research, education, and implementation of restoration protocols worldwide. But the Institute operated under principles that Samuel would have recognized. Knowledge remained freely available, traditional knowledge holders were equal partners in all decisions, and corporate interests that prioritized profit over healing were excluded from governance. As Jake walked through the memorial garden on this quiet morning, he found himself reflecting on the letter his father had left him. Samuel had written about trusting Jake to understand the responsibility of stewardship, to protect the knowledge from those who would exploit it, and perhaps to heal the wounds between generations. All of that had been accomplished, but not in ways that either Jake or Samuel could have anticipated. The protection had come through sharing rather than secrecy. The stewardship had been achieved through community rather than individual control. And the healing between generations had happened not just within Jake's family, but within the larger human community's relationship with the earth itself. Jake paused beside a grove where Tommy was working with a group of graduate students from various countries, teaching them to read the subtle signs that indicated successful ecosystem integration. The young man, who had once seemed uncomfortable with social interaction, was now a confident teacher whose unique insights had become essential. "To restoration science, Tommy," Jake called. "How are the new protocols working?" "Better than expected," Tommy replied, his eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had found work that used all his abilities. "The students are developing adaptations for desert restoration, wetland recovery, and even urban ecosystem development. Your father's basic principles work everywhere once people understand how to listen to what the land needs." Nearby, Rose was working in the traditional plant knowledge section of the garden, teaching children from the local schools how to identify beneficial plants and understand their relationships with soil, water, and other plants. At 74, she had become a global ambassador for indigenous ecological knowledge, but she always returned to the fundamental work of teaching young people to see the world as a living system rather than a collection of resources. "Rose," Jake asked, "do you think Samuel would be happy with what we've built here?" The older woman paused in her teaching, looking around the thriving forest with eyes that held both satisfaction and continuing purpose. "Your father spent 20 years trying to develop the perfect restoration technology. But what you built isn't perfect technology, it's perfect community. People working together across all the boundaries that usually divide them, united by understanding that the Earth's healing is everyone's responsibility." She smiled, returning to her work with the children. "I think he would be very happy." As afternoon approached and Jake prepared to join Elena for their weekly consultation with restoration projects in Kenya and Scotland, Marcus arrived with his young son, Jake's grandson Daniel, named for his great-grandfather Samuel, but called Danny by everyone who held him. At 18 months, Danny was already showing the curiosity about plants and soil that seemed to run in the Harrison family. He could spend hours examining leaves, watching insects, and listening to the sounds of the forest with attention that reminded Jake of his father's focused intensity. "Dad," Marcus said, settling beside Jake on the bench that overlooked the memorial. "Grove, Sophia and I have been talking about the future, about what we want to build for Danny's generation. What are you thinking? We want to establish restoration education centers in major cities around the world, places where urban communities can learn the protocols and adapt them to their local conditions, but also places where young people can understand that environmental healing isn't something that happens somewhere else, it's something they can participate in wherever they are." Jake nodded, recognizing in his son's vision the same practical idealism that had driven Samuel's work. "That sounds like something your grandfather would approve of." As evening approached and the memorial garden settled into the quiet rhythms of a healthy forest, Jake found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this place. It had started with a letter that arrived 3 days too late and 300 acres of burned forest that everyone said was worthless. But the real inheritance hadn't been land or technology or even knowledge. It had been the understanding that some responsibilities are too important to handle alone, and that healing, whether of forests or families or communities, required people willing to work together for something larger than their immediate interests. The carved stone marker that had started everything still bore its ancient symbols and Samuel's newer inscriptions. But now it also held new carvings, added by visitors from around the world, symbols of hope, gratitude, and commitment to the ongoing work of restoration. As Jake prepared to head home to Elena and their evening work coordinating global restoration efforts, he paused for one final look at the thriving forest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new communities eager to learn how damaged ecosystems could heal when given the right kind of help. But tonight, the forest was breathing freely, its roots deep in healthy soil, its canopy reaching toward stars that shone down on a world where healing was not just possible, but happening in communities across every continent. Samuel Harrison's research had become Samuel Harrison's legacy, not because one man had developed revolutionary technology, but because that technology had inspired communities to remember that the Earth's health was everyone's responsibility and everyone's opportunity. In the end, the burned forest had taught them all how to grow,